Hi there, my name is Heidi. I'm a Malaysian author and welcome to my channel. This is my very first YouTube video, and since it's the first one, I thought it'd be nice for me to introduce myself to you and to tell you a bit more about the kind of content that I'll be providing on this channel. So this video will be divided into 3 parts. In part 1, I'll tell you a bit about myself, basically who is this auntie and what is she doing on YouTube. In part 2, I'll tell you more about the kind of content that I'll be providing on this channel. My content is quite niche, so it might not be your cup of tea, but I've decided that I want this content out there. I want it in this place for those who are interested. And finally, in part 3, I'll tell you my mission, the purpose of these videos, why I'm doing them. So without further delay, let's get to it. Who am I? What am I doing here? My name is Heidi Shamsuddin. I'm a Malaysian author of books for both children and adults. Although I'm mainly known for my children's books, I'll put a link in the description box to my website where you can find out more about the books and the other things that I've done. So right now, that's what I'm doing. I write fiction, but that wasn't always the case. In a previous life, in a land far away, I used to be a maritime lawyer. I worked in London, but after living in the UK for over 15 years, I've decided to come home, take a break from the law. And what did I do? I had a few babies. I opened a restaurant with my best friend Annette, which was probably not a good idea, but that's okay because I learned 2 things. One is that I'm not cut out for running restaurants, and number 2, it led me to what I'm doing today, which is to write fiction, to write stories, something that I love. So in the past 10 years, I've written books, short stories, screenplays. I've won an award for a short story I wrote and also a screenplay for a short animated film, Batik Girl. Again, you can check it out on my website. During this time, I made quite an important discovery, which is the allure and magic of Nusantara fairy tales. I became obsessed with these stories, with these fairy tales. I hunted down old books, old references. I was basically like a pirate looking for buried treasure. And not only that, I rewrote some of these stories because either I didn't like the language they use or the emphasis on certain concepts in the stories. So I changed it, I adapted it. One day I sat down to look at all the stories that I had rewritten, and I was shocked to find out that I had actually rewritten more than 50 stories. 50 fairy tales. Which brings us nicely to part 2 of this video, which is what kind of content will I be providing on this channel. And I think you probably have guessed by now, fairy tales, Nusantara fairy tales. Specifically the fairy tales, folk tales, fables, myth, epics, legends, wonder and magic tales from all around Southeast Asia. Now, I know there are very specific definitions of these terms, like what is a fairy tale, what is a folk tale, what is a myth, etc. But on my channel, on this platform, I'm going to refer to these stories broadly as fairy tales because fairy tales is my most favorite word in the whole entire world. So I will be telling you the fairy tales from around the Nusantara. Again, there are many definitions of the Nusantara, but I will use a broad definition, which is to include countries sharing the Austronesian language. Countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, Philippines, Timor-Leste, Madagascar, Oceania, and I will also include countries with an Austronesian minority, such as Singapore, of course, Vietnam, Thailand, and Taiwan. So that's a very broad definition. That's the content that I will be providing on this channel. And that leads us to the third part of this video, which is why am I doing this? Well, in recent years, I realized that even though we are Malaysians, and we live in Southeast Asia, our access to our own fairy tales is quite limited. The main reason for this is that there are very few books, movies, TV programs, etc. that utilizes our own fairy tales as a reference. In fact, we are more familiar with the fairy tales from the West. We grew up with Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, with Cinderella, Snow White, etc. And our children are growing up with those stories too. These stories continue to spread and adapt because we continue to consume and read these stories. I want to shift the focus from these Western fairy tales back to our own Nusantara fairy tales. Why the Nusantara, you might ask? Why not focus on Malaysia? Well, hundreds of years ago, there was no such place as Malaysia or Indonesia. People were free to move and travel in order to trade, to migrate, to find new lands. And this is how our stories managed to travel such long distances. So people brought their stories with them as they traveled. And when they told these stories to, say, their children, these stories changed and adapted to suit the climate, to suit the society, to reflect what was important at that particular time. And this is the special quality of these kind of fairy tales. The fairy tales are, to me, living, breathing entities. They are capable of change, of adaptation. With each retelling, the fairy tales, they become almost like memes. Somewhere along the line, this stop began to look at stories from other countries, other regions. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it's time for us to reclaim our own stories. And this is what I would like to do on this channel. I'll give you an example of the way that these fairy tales spread. The story of Si Tanggang, for example. Si Tanggang is the disobedient son who was turned into stone by the curse of his mother. So you have that story in Batu Caves in West Malaysia, but the same story also exists with the same cast of characters in Brunei and Indonesia. Also, the ancient Chinese tale of Xian, somehow it managed to come from all the way in China and end up in Malaysia and Indonesia as the story of Bawang Putih, Bawang Merah. Recently, I saw a Korean drama called, what was it called? It was called The Fairy and the Woodcutter. And I was shocked to find that it was the same fairy tale that we have here, which is called The Story of the Youngest Fairy Princess of Kayangan, or also known as Hikayat, Malim, Demam. So these fairy tales travel and they move. On this channel here, my goal is simply to tell you a good story so that you might eventually go on to tell that story to your friends, to your children, to your family, and they might then tell the same story to their friends. Like most writers, I dread speaking in public. I'd rather just sit at home in my pajamas and write my stories. The thought of starting a YouTube channel to tell these stories actually terrifies me. But I am willing to overcome that awkwardness because I really believe in these stories and I really, really want to get these stories out there. I want to spread them back into the community, and that's why I'm doing this. So what will I do? I will be putting up a video a week. In these videos, I will tell you a story. I'll tell you a Nusantara fairy tale. We will go into the core of the story. We will see how it might relate to issues we have today. It might not. It might just be a funny story. And then where possible, I will also look into the historical background and make comparisons with similar stories in other countries. We might even go a bit further to the Middle East because a lot of our fairy tales have been influenced by Arabian Nights, also stories from India, China, and also Europe. So that is what we will be doing. At this point, I want to put it out there that I am not an academic. I'm not a folklorist. I am just a very enthusiastic fairy tale lover. I will be quoting some experts, but most of these views on these stories will be mine. I'd like to use this channel also as a form of dialogue between myself and you. I know many of you out there will have access to your own stories, your own fairy tale. it would be great if you could give me a comment or write to tell me your stories, because I will be using this channel as a resource for myself to collect more stories as well. I think that's about it for now. Next week I will be telling you the story of the youngest fairy princess of Kayangan. If you want to join me, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next video.